All right, guys, so we are ready to start our watercolor texture sheet. All right, so what you're going to need for supplies here is obviously our sheet that we have drawn out. You're going to need a palette, which will have your name on the bottom of it. You're going to need your watercolor palette, which also will have your name on it. You're going to need 2 jars of water, one that's going to stay clean and one that is going to be used to rinse our brushes. You're going to need a couple of paint brushes. You're going to want something more of a medium to large brush. You don't want to have small brushes for this because it's going to take up way too much time. And then at your desks, there's going to be little containers and they'll have a few different things in them. You're going to see there's a glue bottle. You're going to see there's a roll of masking tape. You're going to have these 2 little containers here, one marked with an S, one marked with RA. This is rubbing alcohol. This is salt, which we will need for part of our experimentation today. You're going to have a wax crayon. You'll have a few Q-tips in there. You'll have a dropper. Yours will probably look a little bit different from this, but you'll have eyedroppers in there that you're going to need. And you're going to have a piece of plastic wrap. Okay. You should also have a little extra paper towel in addition to paper towel that you're going to use to help dry off your brushes. And that's how we will get started once we have all these materials. So first things first, when we are using watercolor, we are going to need water in it. So the first thing I do is just take a few drops of water. All I'm doing is taking water with my brush and putting it into one of the wells of my palette. And for this, you can pick any colors that you want to start. So I'm just going to pick any color, okay? And the way that our palette is set up, this is a mixing palette. So what that means is you've got a couple of different colors on here that are similar, but they're different in what we call temperature. So they're used to mix different colors. So if I'm looking at my watercolor palette and starting with brown, okay, this is brown. This is my warm red. This is orange, yellow, cool red. You're going to have a warm green, a cool green, blue, purple, and then black. All right, so I'm actually taking from my warm red right now just to have a color, and you'll see that I've kind of like taken my brush while it's wet, I swirl it around in the palette, and then I add it to the water, okay? And this is important because we want to make sure that we are using a watered down version of our color, that we are not using it straight from the palette. It gets very sticky, and that's not something that we're going to be able to use on our watercolor papers. That's not how we use watercolor, okay? And then I'm going to take a little scrap piece of paper here, and I'm going to test my color, and if it's not strong enough, that means that I need to add a little bit more of my pigment to the liquid. Okay, so if I want it to look darker than what I just tested on my test sheet, then I need to keep adding a little bit more of my pigment to the water. And I think that's going to do it for me. That's a little bit darker, so I'm going to go with that as my starting point. So the first thing I'm going to show you how to do is what's called a flat wash. And most of these are going to involve using a flat wash, which is a good trick to have. And when I do this, okay, I'm actually going to sort of lift my paper up at somewhat of like a 45-degree angle. So I'm not going to keep it flat down. I'm going to actually lift it up like this, and I'm going to have gravity help me get the paint in that section, and I'm going to try and get it as even as possible, which is why it's called a flat wash, because you're trying to get a nice flat, even spacing. And as you can see, I've already got some watercolor on my paper because I put a little too much watercolor on my brush. That's okay. Okay, so you want to make sure you've got quite a bit of liquid on your brush, and when you do this, you need to keep going. Okay, there's no stopping once you start a flat wash. So I'm going to try and go right across my box, and I'm just going to kind of work this darker bead of color back and forth, and I'll tip my paper a little bit so you can see that, right? there's this really dark bead of my watercolor, and I am moving that back and forth down my page. I pick up a little bit more, and I continue to move that down my page. We call this feeding the bead. And then I get to the bottom, and there's quite a bit there, so I'm going to actually just dry my brush off onto my paper towel, and then I'm just gonna move this right across the bottom, and it's actually gonna suck up that excess watercolor, and I'm just gonna leave that to dry. And that is what we call a flat wash, because you're trying to make it nice and even, so that way when you are trying to cover a space and get one solid color, you don't want it to be sort of mottled. You will kind of get this nice flat wash by doing that process. Is this good for extremely huge areas? Not great if you're trying to cover a really, really big space, but if you're trying to cover like smaller spaces, but they're bigger than just a little couple of brush strokes, that's what we're gonna want to try to do. All right, so I'm gonna mix up another color here, and the next one I'm gonna look at is actually the one that says wet and dry. So I'm just gonna kind of grab some water, and I'm gonna go with a lighter color this time. I'm gonna go with some yellow, because I wanna be able to see a second color on top of this. So wet on dry means that I'm going to put down a wash of color, let it dry, and then have the ability to paint on top of it. All right, so I'm kind of gathering up, getting some pigment on there. And then I'm going to test my color. My yellow looks really good. So I'm going to, again, practice that flat wash in my wet and dry box. So here I am holding my paper up. I'm kind of preloading my brush up with some watercolor. And then I'm just gonna work that back and forth. Again, there should be a dark bead of color. In this case for me, it's gonna be yellow, that I keep moving back and forth. What'll happen is if you let that get dry, it will start to give you streaks in your work, which maybe you want that for certain things, but a lot of times we want it to be nice and even. So again, I've got that really kind of heavy water bead with my color at the bottom, so I dried my brush off, and I'm just gonna pick that up and let that dry. And in the meantime, while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm gonna mix up a few other colors here. So I'm gonna try and get that done, and then we'll come back to the video and just show you what we're gonna do with these next. All right, so we're back, and I have mixed up several other colors here from my palette, so I can kind of work through the rest of our textures here today. So this is pretty dry now. You can always tell because if you lift up your paper, if you can see it's a little shiny, you'll know that it's still wet. Or you could just lightly tap it with your finger, and if nothing comes off, you'll know that it is dry. So what this means is we've now put our wash down, we've let it dry, so now I can just take color, any color that I want, and I can just paint on top of it. And I can get these really nice, clean, crisp lines. You can do any type of painting on here that you want. I just want you to practice with putting a wet application on top of a dry application. All right. Which then brings me to the wet on wet application. So if we use our context clues, we obviously put a wash down and we let it dry before we put color on top of it. So this time, instead of doing that, I'm going to do my wash, and then while the paper is still wet, I'm going to take a different color and I'm going to work into the paint. And we're going to see what happens when I do that. So I'm actually going to use the same color green that I just used for my wet on dry application. And I'm going to do a wash of this green. So again, I'll start at the top, And you gotta work a little bit quickly. You can't just like sit there and just sort of stare at it and then hope that, you know, things are gonna work out. You do have to work a little quickly for some of these different methods that we're trying today, because if the paint dries before you're able to do the reaction that we wanna get, the reaction isn't going to happen. Okay, so I just sucked up what was left. So I'm going to quickly rinse off my brush. We don't want to cross-contaminate our colors, so I always rinse in between. And then I'm just going to grab my next color, and I'm just going to grab some purple, and I'm going to paint into very similar to what I did before, just to see what the difference is. And you can see that the difference between these two is that when the paper is wet, or when the application is wet, and you go to paint wet into it, it bleeds. It has this really fuzzy effect. So I'll kind of bring this up so you guys can see that a little bit better. Meanwhile, on this side, my lines are crisp and clean. So depending on the effect that you are trying to get, that would be, you know, an interesting thing to sort of do and see what you can do with that when you're looking at your paintings that you're going to be working on. All right. To finish up this top row, we have got something called flat wash / color lift. So we did the flat wash portion of it. Now we're going to do the color lift. So we're going to take some clean water, clean, and I'm going to take my brush. This is nice and dry now. And all I'm going to do is sort of reactivate the watercolor. I'm sort of just making some textures, doing a few things here. And ultimately I'm going to take a piece of paper towel and I'm just going to press, okay? We want to make sure that when we do this that we are pressing, we are not rubbing, we are not dabbing, we're just going to press straight down. And then when I take the paper towel off, you can see I have my paper towel with the red on it, but it can actually lift up some color. This works best the same day that you're painting. It doesn't take, it's not quite as dramatic if you go in the next day and try to do this. You can still do a little bit of color lifting. However, it's not gonna get close to white like we're doing right now. You would have to do a color lift pretty soon after you have painted and let it dry. Okay, so we've done our flat wash and color lift, we've done our wet on wet application, we've done our dry over, or I'm sorry, the wet over the dry application. So I'm going to move right into the wet paper, and all that means is I'm going to take clean water and I'm just going to wet the paper. You can do a little wash, you can just kind of work it back and forth. And my paper is super shiny right now. There's quite a bit of water on there. So I can work into it right now. So I'll take a little bit of my blue and I can just sort of tap and it will run, it will bleed. I can take a little bit of another color. You'll often see this technique used when people are trying to do some interesting backgrounds or just trying to flood a space with color. Wetting the paper helps you move that paint a little bit quicker. So that can kind of work to your advantage depending on what you do. And that's all you're going to do. You're just going to wet the paper and with some clean water and then go into it with your watercolor and just let the paint do what it's going to do, and then we let it dry. All right. Tape, masking tape. One of the easiest applications we've got. Okay, so all I'm going to do with the masking tape, I'm just going to break it up into some little pieces. And I'm just going to lay it in my space. Okay, there's no really right or wrong way to do this. Basically, all you're doing is you are what's called masking. And that means that you are protecting a space from the color that we're about to put down. So I'm going to grab one of my colors, and I'm going to work from light to dark because we're going to try a layering effect. So I'm going to take my yellow again, And that's the first color I'm going to put down. So I'm actually going to do a really quick wash of this, and I'm going to go right over the tape. You don't want to push the tape down too hard. You don't want to press it too far into the paper. Sometimes this type of masking tape has a tendency to really stick to the paper, and it can kind of rip your watercolor paper. So just a light application as long as it's holding. And now I'm going to let that dry. Okay, and I'm going to come back to it. Which means I'm going to move on to salt. So now, for this particular application, you want to make sure you have your stuff ready to go. So it's just, this is regular table salt, nothing crazy, nothing fancy. And again, you have to work pretty quickly when you do this effect. And the darker of the color that you use, and the stronger the pigment is, more like this, a little less of this watery stuff, the more dramatic the effect is going to be. So again, we need to work pretty quickly to do this. So I'm going to do a wash of blue in my salt area. Okay, and again, I've already got my salt uncovered. I want it ready to go because as soon as I finish this wash, I'm going to go for the salt. All right, so again, I'm moving that paint back and forth, trying to keep it as even as I can make it. I get to the bottom, I can suck up just a little bit of that water, and then I'm immediately just going to take a pinch of salt and sprinkle it in different sections of that area. I like to joke and call this, we're seasoning our watercolors today. And you can kind of see, I'll pull it a little closer to the camera, you can kind of see that the salt is starting to kind of draw the color towards itself. You can see it getting a little darker around those little salt granules. And we're going to just let that sort of sit and do its thing. And when it's dry, we can actually kind of rub the salt off of it and get rid of that. All right. So while these two are setting up, we're going to keep moving forward. So under glue, I have already gone ahead and done this ahead of time so that my glue is dry. So one of the things I will typically have you guys do, because this process does take a little while, is by the time we get to the end of class, I will have you apply your glue so it'll be dry for the next day. All right, so if you're watching this video and you haven't already done so, you're just going to want to apply some glue in areas of this box so that it can dry, and then you'll move back to that. And so you can kind of skip ahead in the video if you want to go to the next one. But mine's set up, and I'm going to my glue's nice and dry. All I did was do a couple of just quick little designs because I wanted to see what the reaction was going to be. So I'm going to take a color. I'm going to go for my purple this time. And then all I'm going to do is wash. And what should happen is the glue should resist the watercolor. So you can start to see the design I created starting to pop out. Things that this is good for, you can sort of block out some areas that you want to keep a little bit lighter. If you want it to be a little bit more organic, meaning it doesn't have to be rigid and straight, the glue's good for that because it's hard to control. All right, guys, we got interrupted by the phone, so we are going to continue with our textures, and we are going to move on to the rubbing alcohol. And just like with the salt, we kind of have to be ready to go. So I'm going to take my container that says RA, that's for rubbing alcohol, and I'm going to open up the top, and I got myself one of those newer handy dandy droppers like you guys have, and I'm going to get liquid into the dropper and leave it. I want that ready to go because as soon as I put down my wash, while it is still wet, it is important that it is still wet. I'm going to drip the alcohol on there and let the reaction happen. Okay, so I again have my colors mixed up here. So I'm just going to pick a color and I'm going to do my wash like I have been doing. I'm going to tip my paper up, and again we're going to feed that bead, get the watercolor to flow down the page. This one is really, really highly pigmented, so hopefully we'll get a really good reaction out of this. And then as soon as I put my brush down, I'm going to pick up my dropper and start dropping little drops of alcohol onto the surface. Okay, you can try and get some finer ones. You can try and do some so further away. So if I hold my hand up here and drip, you can kind of see what happens. Just realize it's probably going to splash the further away you get. And now we are going to just let that sort of do its thing. Okay, moving on to the plastic wrap. I'm going to make sure my brush is rinsed off really well. And again, I've got my plastic wrap over here sort of ready to go because I want to grab that as soon as I do my nice wet wash. And again, if it starts to dry, you're not going to get much of a reaction. So again, just with a quick wash, going to go right down the rectangle that I've got here on my page. All the way down to the bottom. I'm going to give my my plastic wrap here just a little bit of a crinkle, and I'm going to put it right down on top of the watercolor and just let it sit. By the time we're done, we should be able to kind of lift this up and see the texture that the plastic wrap sort of created. But for now, we're just going to leave it to dry. So at this point, my tape should be pretty much dry and ready to go. So I'm going to very gently peel up my tape that I laid down on this section. And you're going to see that everything that had the tape covering it has been left white. So sometimes we call this masking. And what that does is it protects areas of your painting to keep things nice and white. So if you have really high highlights, this is a way where you could also work back in. So the next sort of layer to this is I'm going to take the tape, and you can take some fresh tape for this. It doesn't have to be the same pieces like I'm using, but I'm going to use the same pieces because I like to maximize the stuff that I am working with. And I'm just going to kind of place the tape in some different directions. It's covering some of the white, but it's also covering some of the yellow. Just going to gently tap. Remember, you don't want to push this down as hard as you can because it'll cause the paper to sort of rip once the glue of the tape has kind of set and done its thing. So I'm just going to take another color, and this could be pretty much any color that you want. I'm going to use orange just because it's kind of a warm color. It's sort of the next step away from yellow. And I'm just going to do another quick wash of that color over everything. And again, by the time we're done with these last few boxes, I should be able to take this off and you guys can see the reaction that's going to happen from doing this next layer. I'm going to try and get some of the excess paint off, and now I'm just going to leave that to dry. All right. In your containers, you've got these little wax crayons, right? They sort of look like a Crayola crayon, except they are a clear wax. So you're not going to see this no matter what happens when you are applying it to the surface. If you had like a white crayon, it would do a similar effect. You're going to kind of see the white a little bit more. You could theoretically do this with any color of crayon. It just depends on the textures and colors that you're going to do. But for this, I'm just going to try to make a few interesting textures here. I could write a little secret message on there. I know you can't really see what's happening. I'm going to try doing some light marks, some medium darks, some really dark marks, and maybe draw a shape. Right? And this is something that we don't have to sort of wait for. Some of the other stuff, like with our glue, we had to wait for the glue to dry so we could see what was going on there. We don't have to wait for this, which is kind of nice. So I'm just gonna grab my brush full of the color that I'm gonna use, and I am going to reveal what my wax has on my paper. Oh, there's my secret message. I said hi to you guys. And you can see some of the different marks that I made. All right, I apologize guys, my camera keeps going out, so I'm gonna try and pick up as best where I can from where we left off. So I was talking a little bit about the marks. You can kind of see where I did lighter marks here, where you can see more color, less white, and where I really pushed, there's a lot of bright white on there. So this is kind of an interesting technique to use if you're preserving whites. You can also sort of go back in once it's dry. You could reapply the clear wax and then do another layer of color, and then it'll sort of intensify what's happening here. So that's something that you can always experiment with as we go. So then we come to our Q-tip and brush texture. So all we're gonna do, so I've got my brush, and you can try some different things with the brush texture. You can do some really thin to thick little lines, which creates a texture. You can just sort of tap the end of your brush. And depending on what type of brush you have, so I have what's called a round brush. Some of you may have chosen some flats. Those are the ones that are sort of square-ish. You can get different textures with the different bristle styles. And there's even some brushes that are mixed in that are very, very stiff. And you could get some really interesting sort of marks with those as well. So this is a neat technique. So you could kind of do some layering and do some different colors and really see how, and if you work wet into wet, the colors will blend a little bit as you do this, which can be sort of neat and interesting. The other thing you can do, we've got our handy dandy little Q-tips, and these are good for kind of creating some more of a pointillistic look. If you're not sure what pointillism is, it's this movement in art where they used this method of dots, and they created entire paintings out of dots, and they used a lot of color theory, and they sort of mixed colors together using the dots. And they did layers, so you can see how like my purple is super light here. If I allow that to dry, I can go back in with another layer, and they're gonna get a little bit darker when they overlap. So you can really get some kind of cool texture going as well with the Q-tips. They're not quite as bold and bright as when using your brush. So if you wanted to have bold and bright texture, this is something you would have to consider layering to do. So getting that initial layer down, grabbing that color again, and then once things are dry, going back in, and it would sort of bring up that texture. So you can kind of mess around and see what happens with that. And our last texture that we're going to do together for this particular section is paper towel. So I just have like a little scrap piece of paper towel here. It's clean. I'm going to crumple it up a little bit. And much like everything else, I'm going to put my wash down, and I'm going to just sort of dab. And the texture from the paper towel, from crinkling it, will give us an interesting texture look. So I'm just going to mix my blue up a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead with my wash. I'm going to put my wash down. And then while it's still wet, I'm going to quickly just take my paper towel and provide a little bit of texture. And we're going to give that a second to just dry. All right, so we've got our labeled textures complete. So at this point, I think that my plastic is dry enough so I can actually pull the plastic off. And I know it's a little difficult to see, but there's some really interesting texture that sort of creates in doing so. If we look back at our salt, you can kind of see those like little white, almost snowflake like patterns that were created by the salt. If you gently take your finger and sort of rub, the salt will come off and you can expose more of that texture underneath. And I'm going to take my tape off of my tape section so we can take a look and see what my layers have sort of turned into. And you can see I've still got some white, I've got my yellow, and now my orange is really sort of sticking out really brightly. Sorry. Gently pull the tape off, we get our big reveal. So it's kind of cool, you can see how we can really do some sort of magic with the watercolor and the experimentation with some different ideas. So what you're going to do now, you've got 3 empty boxes. And in these 3 empty boxes, I would like you to experiment, okay? That means that I want you to come up with some combination of these particular textures that we tried. So maybe you would like to do some plastic wrap. So you're going to put your wash down, you put your plastic wrap, and then maybe you're going to combine that with some tape. So once you take that off, you'll put the tape over it, you'll do another wash, take the tape off, and then see what happens. What I'm going to tell you to do is to write what you've done on those boxes. So if you come up with a texture that you think is really neat or something that you could use for your project, you're going to know what you use to create that effect, okay? I would suggest going anywhere from like 2 to 4 methods on one. 4 is kind of a lot, but you could definitely try a few different things. Maybe you do some wet on wet painting and then sprinkle it with some salt and see some different reactions there. That's going to be completely up to you. So I'll give you guys that opportunity to work on these 3 boxes, and then we're going to come back and work on the bottom section of our color chart.